My name is Ben Von Wong, and I'm a photographer.
I think that we live in a rapidly changing world right now, and whether we admit it or not, our lifestyle is pretty unsustainable for the environment around us. I wanted to create a series of images that would highlight everyday normal people to be doing normal activities with a building up of a storm in the background, and I thought that the two together would tell a really nice story around climate change.
I'm super excited to have Ben Von Wong join us. Ben has been a longtime friend now, I can say, I think. We developed a relationship because Ben was a customer and he called some of our staff with really creative questions. Ben is one of the most creative people I know. And the staff quickly escalated to me because they didn't know some of the answers, and some of the uses that he had were out of the box, which is, I think, a good way to describe Ben as well. And so we began the dialogue, we collaborated on some thoughts and some things that cannot be done, and tried to help him achieve some of the creative visions that he had for some of the projects that he was working on. And frankly, Ben has even worked us because he's probably one of the top minds in terms of using social media for impact. And so we've also asked for his help sometimes when we're trying to be more efficient about, sharing things with people online and stuff like that. So Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man. Happy to be here.
Let's start in the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about your story of becoming a photographer. I know some of the backdrop, but I won't spoil it. But I think it's a really cool and unique story about, being where you are today.
Yeah. So I have a background as a hard rock mining engineer. That's actually what I went to university for. And photography sort of came to me in the middle of on the last year of my education. I became a hard rock mining engineer, not because I wanted to become an engineer. It was just because I didn't know what else to do with my life. And after high school, you go to university and it's sort of, you just follow the track. And it was only like a year before graduating where I was just like, oh crap, what happens after? What happens when you graduate? This isn't what I actually want to do. And I actually bought my first camera while I was working in a mine in Winnemucca, Nevada. A girl broke up with me and I was just like, I need to find a hobby, otherwise I'm going to go crazy. What could I possibly do? And so it was one of those things where I was just really looking for anything to keep my mind off of this breakup. And I noticed that the stars were really beautiful out in the desert. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Stars are pretty. Let me just figure out how to take pictures of the stars. So I went out, bought a camera. And I think things really picked up once I realized that I could potentially get paid to have a good time. In my book, you paid to have fun. And it was really rare, this idea that one could get paid to do something that I enjoyed doing. And so when I was offered my first gig to shoot an event, I started realizing that photography was not only something that got me access to things. I could go behind the scenes of a stage, of a show. I could actually get invited to things I would never get invited to. And it just sort of opened up an entire new way of interacting with the world that was really, really cool for me. After doing events for a while, I started to realize that photography was starting to look a lot like a job, and the idea was always for photography to be more of a hobby than a job. And so I was still working as a hard rock mining engineer, and I was doing photography on the evenings and weekends, and I decided that I wanted to retain that fun and that passion. And so I decided to put aside the photography business and do creative things. And that's where I started doing a lot of the fantasy, a lot of the experimenting and so forth that you can see on screen right now. So this was a lot of my earlier work, is how can I use my camera to capture worlds that, I couldn't really interact with in real life. And I think sometime around 2012 is when I decided that there is an opportunity here to take this potentially full time. I didn't necessarily want to be a professional photographer. I just knew that I didn't want to be an engineer. And I learned quickly that because I had developed a following on social media that I could actually travel the world for free by taking photographs, by simply offering to teach a workshop somewhere with a photo club. They would kind of find the members, sell the tickets, and I would have a free ticket somewhere to go and visit. And in exchange, I would just share the passion, the creativity, and the way these things were produced. For example, if we look at this photo over here, it was created by taking snow and just like throwing it up into the air, and that would just create snowfall. And it's just little tricks like that people would find entertaining, like 3-point lighting setups and so forth. So a lot of my earlier sort of enabling of traveling was through workshops and education and very much technical tricks on how to take cool cinematic photographs.
Uh-huh. And when you started, was this still in Nevada, or were you moving around? Were you based somewhere else?
Yeah, I was moving around a lot. So after Winnemucca, Nevada, which was a work term, I did that for 4 months. I came back to Montreal, and I was in Montreal for about 3.5 years, with a couple work contracts in other places. But by and large, I was just stuck in Montreal. And I think for me, when I quit my day job, the biggest thing that I gained wasn't so much time. Like, you assume you get 40 hours back if you're doing 40-hour weeks. But the truth is, even during your 40-hour week, when you have these sort of side hobbies and passions, you're spending a lot of your, like, as you're working, there's a lot of background sort of processing that goes on. Your break time, you're not really gaining those 40 hours back. You're maybe gaining about 20 hours, but what you do gain is freedom of space, freedom of place. You can go anywhere in the world. And so for me, when I quit my day job, what was really cool was just I suddenly had the world at my fingertips, because it didn't matter where I physically was. I could go anywhere and I could create from there.
What were some of your early inspirations? Because, like, some of the first stuff seems like it was inspired by some of the locations that you were. I imagine that some other stories were stories that you wanted to tell, some make-believe, some storytelling components. What were some of the early visions that you had and some of the stories that you were interested in sharing?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, it wasn't so much about the stories themselves of the images, but rather the story of the journey. I think I've always had this sense that anyone can be creative. They just need to put the time and energy and effort into it. And I wanted to just find ways to share the ability to do really crazy things with really low amounts of money. And so I was always looking for tricks, right? Like, what is the trick to find really great costumes? Or what is the trick to find cool locations? Or what is a trick to shoot with fire? And so I'd always be hunting for different ways, whether it was through a combination of special effects, perspective trickery, a way of interacting with the world, a way of convincing people. And so that was a lot of like my earlier stuff, is trying to achieve the maximum results with the minimum amount of resources.
Got it.
So I was very much like, I wasn't inspired so much by the end result as much as the journey, right? So like, how might anyone learn how to take photos with fire? And so yes, it was about capturing exposure. Yes, it was about timing, but what if you added multiple exposures? What if you added a neutral density filter and did some like light painting? What if you tried to carve shapes out of fire, right? So it's like taking the medium, which is a cool medium, but then expanding the definition of what that could be. And then as I was experimenting with the different ways that this tool could manifest, I would try to create I would try to find the different answers to these creative questions that I hadn't quite yet solved. So it was more like the medium or the person or the place would inform the art that would result from it.
Got it. How was the transition into causes? Because it seems, obvious that at some point you made it a priority, that it was more than just commercial photography, more than just impressing people. And your work is quite impressive, but that it became more than that, and that you wanted to educate people and bring light on subjects that you considered important. How would you describe that transition?
Yeah, so it was in 2015 or so, I got the largest project of my career. I mean, it paid more in this one gig than my entire career combined. And it was just like, wow, there is so much money out here. I just need to find it. And in some ways it was the dream, right? I think many creatives dream of getting paid to do what you do best. And so I got to that point, I think fairly quickly. It was maybe 3 years since I had quit my day job at the time. And only to realize that that wasn't enough, right? Just getting paid to do good work didn't give me the satisfaction I thought I needed.
Okay.
Because it made me realize that just creating cool things for the sake of creating cool things, ultimately, it didn't change anything in the world. All it did was move product off the shelf for someone else. And so it made me start to wonder, like, okay, yes, there's impact in what you do because I'm creating work and I'm trying to inspire people to pursue their passions, but that's in the journey of what I create. But what if the end result itself could educate or inspire or inform or transform people? What if the end results, the purpose of the photo itself had an extra layer of meaning? And so sometime in 2016, I decided I was going to take an entire year off to figure this thing out. Like, how was I going to attach impact into my life? And initially I thought it wasn't going to be possible with fantasy. I was like, if you take fantasy and you fuse it with impact, like the two feel diametrically opposed. And in some ways, when you look at impact filmmakers and so forth, they're always these like gritty documentaries or otherwise. It's like the fantasy element isn't part of these kind of very deep conversations. And so I actually took a break. I went into documentary filmmaking for a little while, realized I wasn't too good at it. and then just sort of like took some steps out of that to try to figure out, well, would it be possible to fuse fantasy and impact together? And initially I thought that it would be really easy. I could just go up to all these different nonprofits and say, hey, I'm happy to work with you for free. I just want to experiment. I want to play. Let's see what we can do. But it turns out that nobody likes risk and nobody has time to waste. And so no one wanted to take the chance to see like, what's this like random artsy photography guy gonna be able to accomplish? And so I have to say it was, I don't know, it took me like a year and a half before I got my first paid job in impact from that moment of deciding that I was only gonna do impact.
Which one was that?
It was with Nike when I put social impact entrepreneurs on the edge of skyscrapers.
I think I remember that. Yep.
And yeah, but the reason is it really took me proving that it was possible to create impactful projects on my own before anyone was going to take that risk to let me experiment and play with my own projects, right? Okay. So no one is going to take a risk on you if you can't prove that it's possible yourself. And so I had to kind of go through those motions of experimenting and learning and proving that fantasy and impact could coexist. And yeah, so this Nike project, you know, they came to me and they wanted photographs of athletes on kind of defying gravity, because I had done a couple of things involving heights, putting superheroes on the edge of skyscrapers, and they wanted me to do the same. And it was my pushback. I told them like, hey, why don't we not use Instagram influencers? Why don't we use social entrepreneurs instead? Like, this is Brian, and he makes these sustainable bamboo bicycles that are fair trade and ethically sourced. And Nike's one of his sponsors. And so cool. Rather than just highlight people who were popular for the sake of being popular, we found people who were worthy and elevated them to the stage. And so, you know, I talked to Brian and I asked him, like, what use is this image to you, right? I mean, there's no direct connection. And for him, he's like, I open up my presentations with this image because I want people to see and think and see me differently and think about what I'm doing as something that defies boundaries. And it was just a really interesting anecdotal story of how the power of an image can really shift people's perspective of a person instantly, because in social entrepreneurship settings, this is not the image you open up with, right?
Right. That's so cool. So is it fair to say that it was layered, right? So it's like you kept adding layers to the work and it sort of evolves, and then you see what works, what inspires you, which areas interest you, and you kind of keep growing from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so if we say like I started off trying to learn photography, and then I got better at photography, and then I added lighting, and then I added costumes, and then I added cool locations, and then I started adding a layer of video because I started documenting my stuff, and then I started adding a layer of impact, and then now that impact has sort of shifted from just creating temporary sets to now building actual semi-permanent installations. And now we're all in lockdown, so I don't know what the next layer is going to be. but yes, it's all these different layers of experience that kind of come into play. And I think what's interesting about that is that it creates a really unique identity, right? It's like you start off just being someone who can take cool pictures, but then as you add more complexity into it, that sort of defines your brand. It defines who you are. It defines what you're capable of doing.
Okay, I want to get back to this, but I found something you said really interesting. You said that you found out you weren't really good at documentary filmmaking. And I'm curious to what your process for coming to that conclusion. What makes you say that you were no good at it?
I think I wasn't horrible at it. I was capable of making documentaries. I was capable of telling stories. But when I compared myself to top tier filmmakers, I realized two things. I realized that one, I didn't love the process of it. Like I don't love spending hours piecing together stories alone in front of my computer. And that's very much what video editing is.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I also realized that like the magic of what I do, of like creating worlds and doing something that no one else was doing, and like and pushing the boundaries of imagination, was something that I didn't know how to do within the world of documentary filmmaking. And so it was maybe I phrased that incorrectly. It wasn't so much that I wasn't good at it, but rather that I wasn't interested in it enough to get really good at it, right? Like after going in, testing it out, buying the gear, figuring it out and playing in it, it was like, this isn't the right fit for who I am and what I do. I think there might be a better way for me to show up and to serve in the world.
Got it. That makes more sense now. Okay, that's why I asked. Okay. And so once you got into some of these purpose, concepts, are there a couple that you can tell us about, or that you feel, I know it's like picking a favorite kid, but are there some that you can tell some stories or chat a little bit about, so that people can learn more about what goes into them, the hardships, the process that you go through?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we start with this image that you have on the screen right now, this was a project that we did around electronic waste with Dell. And so they had seen a prior project of mine. Remember how I said nobody likes to take a risk and take a gamble on something? So they need to see that it's possible first, even if it's slightly different. So they had seen my project where I put a mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles, and now they were like, hey, can you do the same thing with electronic waste? And I'm an activist, but at the same time, I don't know that much about the world, because I don't I like to share stories of how I am learning about the world too. So they're the ones that told me about electronic waste. So then I did my homework to learn more about what electronic waste was. And through that process of learning, of understanding what the problem is, I then got creative and tried to figure out what a creative representation of the problem might be. Mm-hmm. The brand comes to you with a bunch of different constraints. So in the case of Dell, they wanted to make sure that it was something that was futuristic, that was positive, that wasn't too grimy, that was really cool and technological. So they kind of gave those constraints. And then I tried to find a way to interpret that into some creative expression. So I'm almost taking a business incentive and I'm converting it into an artistic expression to ignite curiosity, to draw people in. And so in this case, we were trying to create the idea of how the past could power the future. And so in order to do that, we took all these old school electronics, all these used parts that they had lying around. And so in order to know what was available, I did a tour of the factory. We had a bunch of conversations, understood which materials they were actually recycling and how they were manifesting into their new products. And then I started looking for different inspirations of what were some futuristic technologies or futuristic movies that we were inspired by. And so there is this, like this scene over here, like the spiral that we created is actually from a movie out of Blade Runner, 2049 Blade Runner. They open up the scene with these solar farms. And so that's where this shape comes from. But it isn't just about the shape itself, it's about how you're going to create it. And one of the things that I really try to do is I try to show how creativity is accessible to anyone. It doesn't have to be a high budget production. So while one strategy would have been, we could have taken maybe a projector, a pattern, and projected it and then placed the laptops accordingly, we ended up creating this pattern just using chalk and string and rope. And actually reached out to one of my friends who's a sand art artist and asked him how to create different patterns on the ground. And we came up with basically the mathematical way to create these sort of patterns. And so, and that's what makes these photos interesting. It's like when you know that all you needed was chalk and chalk and string, and that the back of this set was just pieces of plywood. And we just used staple guns to paint out these sort of Tron-like patterns on the background. And that, I don't know if you can notice in this photograph, there's like a drone. There's a flash with a drone to light up the set from the center. Yeah. And these are just things, and behind the model is someone with a leaf blower. And these are like, it's almost like these process images that show how it's done that make the photograph even more exciting, even more relatable, even more interesting. Were there better ways to do this? Absolutely. Like if we had like a super C-stand that was like hanging this lighting, or we had set this up in a Hollywood way, it would have been easier. It would have been more accurate. The final result would have probably been better. But I really like to make it approachable and funny and organic. And that story of how we got to the final result is almost more important than the final result itself.
Yeah, this is a microcosm of kind of, this whole series that we've been doing with a lot of our customers, ambassadors, users. Is so emblematic of how much more there is than meets the eye. I've known you, I know some of these projects, but just talking to you and listening to you describe it shows how much work, how much passion, how many people have to come together to make those things happen. And frankly, how much more interesting the images, the content becomes when there's story to it. And so, it is documentary-like in a sense that you are still telling stories. What are some of the lessons that you've learned? Because I know you've done a number of these projects, and this is just one of them. As you evolved, what was some of the takeaways and some of the lessons that you've learned over time?
Oh man, there's so many lessons. I think maybe a couple of the more interesting or maybe more applicable lessons for viewers who may be creative or struggling to sell themselves, or saying, if only I had X, then I could do Y. I think it's always important to figure out what you're capable of doing alone. Even within the spectrum of these like larger projects, you might look at them and be like, oh man, I wish I could have access to all this capital or these people and so forth. When you look through my portfolio, I don't think you'll notice which projects are self-funded, personal projects, and which ones are commercial corporate projects. Because they're all grand, they're all crazy. And the difficulties that you encounter with a smaller project are very different than the difficulties that you encounter with a bigger project.
Very interesting.
But the difficulties are still there.
Mm-hmm.
So like what you might gain from having a large corporate client, let's say you get a lot of money, you get a lot of access, you get a lot of crew, you'll lose out on flexibility. It means that everything that you do has to be pre-approved. So you spend a lot more time in pre-production. You have a lot of liability issues, meaning that you're actually not allowed to do certain things. And when it's really one of those things where like all of the skills that you learn, so if you learn how to get hundreds of people together to participate on something that has no money, you're also going to acquire that same skill set of storytelling and convincing people that will be applicable in a commercial setting, because you're going to still be able to channel that sort of energy and passion. And these are like kind of core skill sets that you're never going to lose. So I think one of the really interesting ways to approach personal projects and to approach goals of where you're trying to get to and what you're trying to achieve is to think about how are you going to build the staircases, the steps towards success of what you're trying to get to. Don't think of it like, if only I could do this project, then I'll unlock that level. It's not really how it works. It's just, how can I build the next step to get me closer there? And you just build step after step after step. And it doesn't matter how big or small those steps are, but as you acquire these different pieces, as you slowly crawl your way up and up and up, you eventually unlock the greater possibilities. So I hope that's not too metaphorical, but it's all good. So that video that you just started playing, Mermaids Hate Plastic, is actually one of my personal projects. It got 37 million views on the native Facebook video alone, but this is a project that happened within a 4-week period because I was going to come home and take photos of my sister's wedding. And I just happened to be in town. My mom found a mermaid tail designer, and I was like, oh, mermaid tail, I really want to shoot that, but I need to find an impact angle to it. And at the time, there was a lot of conversation around ocean plastics. And so, I had a conversation with a friend and said, if only I had access to lots of plastic bottles, I think I could really make something really cool. And he's like, oh, just let me call a couple people. And he calls on his second phone call to a recycling company. That recycling company said, sure, we'd love to participate, because they had seen the fantastical work that I had done and they understood the messaging. Then they wanted to be a part of it. And they were like, hey, where can we ship these 10,000 plastic bottles? It'll come in an 18-foot truck. And I was like, whoa, what? I didn't know 10,000 plastic bottles took up so much space. And then we had to find a warehouse. And so then it became but then the conversation almost gets easier, because now you're like, hey, I have a mermaid. I have 10,000 plastic bottles. I just need a place to do this thing. Where might we find this? And so you just kind of pull on that thread one step at a time, and you just slowly unfurl it. And I don't know, it's so funny, because when I look at these projects, and so many of these projects are the same, when I look at how they actually happen, there's often no reason why they should have worked, right? There are just so many coincidences and so many moments of serendipity that are necessary for these projects to happen, but they somehow happen. And the thing is, nobody knows about your failures. Nobody remembers the projects that were mediocre. They only see and remember your most successful ones. So I think that's just something to always keep in mind.
Yeah, as I've been in business in different ways, and product management is one of them. And I used to always say that a product has 99 reasons to fail, and it takes everything working together for it to succeed, right? Any one thing can ruin it, and I think you've just voiced it well here. And it also is a testament to the many skills and experiences and, the drive towards making that vision happen, that you have to kind of keep herding the cats and pushing the rocks uphill to make it all come together. I wanted to ask you about this precisely because I think I know a little bit of the answer, but I wanted you to comment on the gear, because we were talking about cameras and, what cameras and lenses you use. And so I just wanted to ask you, what's your vision of using gear for a project, and how important that is versus the vision and what you have?
Yeah, so in my case, the story is the most important part, right? So how you get to the end result is almost as important, if not more important, than the final result. And through that lens, what I have learned is that if you use equipment that is too expensive or too fancy, people don't relate to it as well. So there was a point in my career where I was shooting with medium format, $80,000 camera system. I had $20,000 of lighting, and I was going out to these shoots and I was taking really cool images. But I noticed that people would just kind of tune off, and they'd be like, oh, I don't have that gear, I can't do that. Or, lucky you, woo, you get access to all this stuff. and so that sort of prompted the opposite kind of flip back. It's almost a question of like, how can I do the most with the least amount of stuff? And on that same note, I used to travel a lot prior to COVID-19. And so it became about what can I travel with that would be like the essential core things that I could do the most with the least amount. And so today I use an A7R II. It's, what is it, like 5 years old at this point? I think I have a scratched lens that I haven't changed because I just don't want to spend more money on it because I don't need it. When I did this Strawpocalypse video that you're showing, I actually showed up to this country, to this project with no lighting because I figured that I'd meet someone there who had some lights that I could borrow. And so I just used whatever speed lights that were available that showed up there. And so I've almost adopted this reverse approach now where it's like, it doesn't matter what you have. You know, the camera that I use the most these days is my cell phone. It's, you know, these things have multiple lenses now. They do a pretty good job. It feels like, you know, I mean, I have better cameras, so I think there's still a minimum of quality that's expected of you when you're, you know, professional photographer. So I actually do use my professional system to get the results that I need. Mm-hmm. But there's always this dance of like the two, right? You almost want to make it so relatable that someone with a phone can actually dream. And so I try to juggle the two. One of the things that I really like about the Outex housing as an example of that is that it's so light. So if I think that I'm going to be in a situation where I might get wet and I'm not sure, I can just toss this into my bag and it takes up zero space. It takes up zero weight. Whereas a big underwater housing, which I have never owned, by the way. So I've done like 3 or 4 massively viral underwater shoots, but I still don't own a single camera housing underwater except the Outex. And so, you know, what I found useful there is through relationships. So Nauticam has sponsored a whole slew of these projects. On my most viral photo shoot where I did it, I shot 30 meters underwater in a shipwreck in Bali. I actually flooded my camera the day before and I just ended up using the camera of some other guy that happened to be there. And I don't know, like, I think there's something that's just so much more relatable about that. When you say it doesn't matter what gear you have, you can do it with whatever.
That I think relatability is the key word. And, you know, I think that there's so much truth to what you're saying on multiple levels, whether it is, you know, for the story to resonate with people or for content creators that want to create stories that also don't want to feel like it's unattainable, like you said. That makes perfect sense.
There is a downside to it, though.
Okay.
There is a downside to it. It's that if you just use gear that is old, no one wants to sponsor you. Because that's how all these companies work, is that they're trying to sell you the latest, greatest of everything. It's all, buy this tool so you can accomplish this. And they're selling you on this idea that you need X in order to do Y. So I have found that, like, as a result of not being on the cutting edge of the super cool tool and the super newest, bestest, fastest, quickest, most amazing thing, you kind of lose out on a lot of sponsorship opportunities, which arguably is one of the major avenues that a content creator makes money, either through affiliate links or pushing product or otherwise. And that's something that I've had to step out of. But I don't know, it also fits into this idea of conservation, right? Like, you don't want to push people to just keep buying stuff that they don't need.
Right. I think it's a balance, right?
Yeah, it is a balance.
Yeah, you have to balance the passion that you have into following that versus following the market per se. But also the balance, like you said, between what's important for my creative process, for my travel style, for the way that I shoot, for the different gear that I'm going to use, versus just having it for the sake of having it. So that all makes sense. The other thing that you're saying that relates to something João Carlos, another photographer that's based in Europe and New York, we were talking to the other day, is that he said that a lot of commercial shoots, or a trend that at least he sees, is that they're migrating towards smaller, more frequent campaigns. So, for example, you know, they may spend $50,000 on a campaign that's supposed to last a year, And now more and more brands are shifting towards maybe 3 campaigns that spend that $50,000 over a period of months. So maybe they do 3 campaigns a year with that budget that are more timely, more focused, more regional. And that hopefully gives people like you, creative content creators, an opportunity to tell different stories, to do it in a more manageable way. What do you think about that? Or do you see that happening?
Well, I see that as a negative for me personally, right? So the way I work and the way my work is born is actually by focusing on creating fewer, more complex, more expensive projects, as opposed to creating many simpler, dumbed down concepts. And from a business perspective, though, I totally understand it. Why would you want one campaign that costs, let's say, $100,000 that may or may not perform, right? You're almost gambling. It's like a lottery. When you can have 100 campaigns at $1,000 each, that you can A/B test and decide which one is working to pour more advertising dollars into. It actually makes a lot more sense to do things that are less innovative, to just stick with the flow. And that's actually the reason why you start noticing on Instagram that every single project starts to look the same, is because very few people are innovating anymore. They're just trying to create content. But content, when it's just created for the sake of making noise, of being present, well, it ends up just being noise. It becomes about creating content that is ultimately forgettable. Maybe it's like double tap. Wait, I don't remember what I saw anymore because I've seen it before. It's cool. It just gives me like a little tickle, a little hit of dopamine as I swipe and double tap, but it's not creating the visceral sort of like pull. So one of the things that I personally aspire for is every project that I create, I try to own a piece of someone's heart. I want them to see something and then 5 years down the road, they'll look at it and they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. And this still happens. So within the conservation circles, I might be going around and showing my portfolio or starting a conversation with someone. They'll be like, oh my gosh, I saw that like 4 years ago. That was you. That's the kind of impression that I try to make on people. But I do feel like the market may be shrinking for those kind of things. And it makes sense given that the ecosystem doesn't prioritize this kind of content. And so for me, it's been about trying to find ways to adapt. And that's actually why I've shifted into experiential events, because for a while, this was a growing market. Everyone was shifting towards paying for experiences rather than paying for stuff. And that felt like a really good place to be until coronavirus. And so right now I'm in the process of redefining or reevaluating what is my role in the world. And I don't have the answers. I honestly am not sure how I fit in, but I think that in times of crises, society starts to break down. We start to have like the fractures and the tensions that were pre-existing start to show. And in those fractures lie opportunity for change, growth, development. And while I might not know what opportunities exist for me at this very moment, I am actually welcoming the idea of a blank canvas. It feels quite exciting to know that I can actually book whatever I want 3-6 months down the line, because no conference, no event, no job is going to bother me at this stage. So, yeah, but there are good days and bad days, man. There are days where I feel like this freedom is great, and there are other days where I'm just like, man, I am a 33-year-old dude living at home with my parents. This is not what was this was not the plan. So,
well, you've got to go through the valleys to both appreciate, the peaks and to reach them in a way. So I think in a way, the cream rises. And these transitional periods are about the best, recrafting, reinventing, reevaluating. You never know. Like, you yourself, discovered photography and taking photographs as a means to reinvent yourself. And you never know how this is also going to evolve into pushing the boundaries and the creativity and the way that you harness that creativity in different ways. But
Yeah,
I think the talent shows, and the work, I think, speaks for itself. And at the end of the day, you know, not everybody with a camera, even with a phone, can create compelling content. And so it is a challenge, I agree with you. But I think that, you know, the work will speak for itself.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, only time will tell. Right now, I'm having a lot of fun experimenting with non-visual mediums. I started a podcast called Impact Everywhere, and I'm interviewing people who are having a positive impact in the world in unexpected ways, because I found that it's a really great way to learn. It's a great way to meet people. It's a great way to create serendipity, even if no one listens to it. And so that's been like a really fun experiment. How it ties into my general career, not quite sure, but I'm sure that in 5 years, if we had another conversation, I'll be like, thank God I started that podcast. I learned XYZ thing as a result of it. One of the other things,
I was just going to say, sometimes you plant seeds and you don't know how long it'll take them to germinate and whether, you know, it's going to be a tree or a bush.
Yep.
And they turn out to be wonderful.
Yeah. One of the things that the podcast has triggered has been this new experiment over here. Let me see.
I saw that post today. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been like cutting out paper art because I was looking for a way to take the words of the podcast and convert it into some kind of visual, because ultimately I don't have a visual way of promoting what I'm doing. And so now I'm experimenting with paper cutouts, and I think I could maybe create some dioramas out of paper using words that may be really interesting. So it's unlocking creativity in sort of a secondary and tertiary way that I don't think I would have had otherwise. And so, you know, sometimes I think it's about being patient and trusting the process and being okay with not knowing and being lost for a little while. And it's easy to say it now. I mean, it sucks when you're going through it.
Right.
But that's just part of what it's like to be a creative almost.
Well, listen, I have no doubt that, you know, your content is going to continue to shine through. I always see the work and I can kind of tell that it's yours. I've had this chat with a lot of our ambassadors, and, you know, I ask them, do you have a style? Do you put work into your style? And many of them say, not really, but people tell me that I have one. And I don't know how you feel, but I definitely feel like your work has a look, has a distinguishable presence that's not, you know, easy to copy. And so I hope you take that as a compliment, because it's meant to be.
Yeah,
but,
thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time to sharing with us the creative process that you go through, some of your history, the behind the scenes of some of this work, because I know people appreciate it. And, you know, stay positive, stay productive. And I hope that we have a chance to get together physically soon. I'm personally missing the body contact, the hugs, you know, and being together with people. So we all have to do the right thing, but hopefully we'll soon be able to return to life resembling what it is in the new reality.
I think the timeline might be 2 years or 3 years. So I'm expecting to be disappointed. So I'm trying to keep expectations low personally.
Yeah, I think it'll be a new reality, you know, for a while, until there's a vaccine. You know, different countries are going to act in different ways.
You might need to make an Outex bodysuit so people can go out and hug.
Yeah, we get enough innuendo for our product. But yeah, no, I saw a really creative Canadian viral video the other day of somebody using shower curtains so that they could hug their mom on Mother's Day. So they hung out a shower curtain and they cut arms into it so that people could come together and hug. So yeah, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. So that's probably not a bad idea.
There you go.
But-
Outex Huggables. Got
There
the
you go.
name.
I'm gonna borrow that.
It'll be
Ben,
great.
always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. And like I said, let's stay in touch. If there's anything we can do or help, you know where to find us.
All right. Take care, guys. Be safe.
Peace.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.